I was in my kitchen this morning waiting for the coffee to brew. I picked up my phone just for a quick look at the world. And the world, it seemed, was on fire.
Oh, what happened?
It was all about this one comment from Friedrich Merz. The feeds were just a wall of absolute moral fury. Headlines were screaming. People I follow were posting these incredibly passionate, almost apocalyptic warnings about what he'd said about the cityscape. I mean, the level of vitriol, you'd think he'd personally declared war. It was visceral.
Wow. Okay.
So naturally, I got curious. I found the actual clip, just a few seconds long. I listened. He said, "We still have this problem in the cityscape." That was it.
Those were the whole comment.
That was it. No slurs, no specifics, just that one ambiguous phrase. And I stood there, coffee machine humming, looking at this explosion of outrage on my phone and then back at the clip. The two things just didn't connect. The reaction was so disproportionate to the actual input, it felt rehearsed, like a ritual.
And that feeling, that sense that the outrage is less a spontaneous emotional breakdown and more a pre-programmed social ritual. That's exactly what we're diving into today.
Okay.
Our mission is really to unpack that ritual, to understand the unseen systems that take a brief, ambiguous, and non-specific comment, like the one about the cityscape, and transform it into this collective moral drama that just consumes public attention.
Yeah, it feels like more than just people getting mad online. It feels like the very foundations of public communication are being, eroded somehow.
They are, because the intensity you witnessed isn't just emotion, it's a social system. We sometimes call it the moral machine.
The moral machine, okay.
When a phrase is ambiguous, it reliably triggers this collective mechanism where communication fundamentally shifts. The goal stops being, seeking understanding or dialogue or resolution.
Right.
Instead, the focus becomes Selbstberotung. It's a great German word for it. Signaling one's moral alignment, positioning oneself within the in-group, and defining who you are by what you publicly condemn.
So the goal isn't really to critique Mertz's policy or even his specific statement, but to perform my own moral identity for my peer group.
Precisely. And to truly understand how a mild, ambiguous phrase can instantly become like a political explosive device, we need to examine three interconnected layers.
Okay, what are they?
First, the fundamental psychological difference between the two main condemning emotions, anger and disgust, and what distinct, crucial social signals they actually communicate.
Anger and disgust, got it.
Second, the modern digital architecture, specifically the algorithms and the platform design, which actively exploit and amplify these emotional triggers, mostly for engagement.
The tech side.
Exactly. And finally, the ultimate consequence, how language itself transforms from being, ideally, a bridge for complex ideas into this volatile moral trigger zone.
That roadmap is perfect. Let's start with the basics then, the human condemnation part. When we judge something morally wrong, we often use anger or disgust. They feel kind of similar in the moment, maybe, but psychologically, what different signals are we really sending to someone watching when we express one versus the other? Why does that choice of emotion define the whole moral context?
Yeah, it's probably the single most important distinction to grasp here. While both signal disapproval, obviously, they diverge fundamentally in what they attribute the failure to.
Okay.
And that dictates how observers react and, crucially, whether reconciliation is even seen as possible.
So lay out that core functional distinction for us. Anger first, maybe.
Okay, so anger focuses primarily on the action taken and its bad consequences. When you express anger, whether it's, loud, aggressive anger or just quiet frustration, you are communicating that a bad thing happened because of harm or unfairness or maybe a violation of my autonomy.
So it's about the event.
The focus is on the measurable event, the resulting damage, or the specific behavior. Anger is inherently, transactional in a way.
And moral disgust. We're not talking about, rotten food here.
Oh, no, we're talking about the socio-moral parallel. Moral disgust focuses overwhelmingly on the person and their perceived bad moral character.
Ah, right.
When moral disgust is expressed, the communicated message is pretty clear. This is a fundamentally bad person. They are stained or tainted somehow.
Okay.
And this is where the attribution bias really kicks in hard. Instead of attributing that ambiguous statement like Merz's to maybe a lack of clarity or a poor choice of words or just a momentary lapse, external factors.
Right. Giving the benefit of the doubt.
Exactly. Instead of that, the observer attributes it directly to the speaker's internal, stable, and enduring character flaw.
So if I express moral disgust toward a politician's comment, I'm not really engaging with what they said. I'm basically issuing a judgment about who they are as a person, permanently. whereas anger is more reserved for the impact of the mistake they made.
Exactly. And that shift in focus is profound. It impacts every subsequent interaction. There are studies, actually, analyzing public reactions to ambiguous moral scenarios, and they can confirm this pretty clearly. Disgusted expressions reliably lead observers to infer the condemner's focus is on the wrongdoer's disposition, their character. Angry expressions, in sharp contrast, lead observers to focus more on the tangible harm caused or the consequences that need managing.
That difference must have huge implications for how people decide to act afterwards, right? I mean, if you think someone is fundamentally flawed, you don't engage with them in the same way you would with someone who simply made a mistake.
Absolutely. This is the difference in what we call action tendency. Anger signals a tendency toward direct action. Confrontation, maybe verbal argument, insults, or trying to stop the perpetrator directly. Crucially, anger often demands engagement because you feel you need to fix the harm or address the action.
Okay, direct action for anger and disgust.
Disgust signals a much stronger tendency toward indirect punishment. This is the low-contact route. Things like social exclusion, withdrawal, avoidance, shunning, gossip.
Keeping your distance.
Right. Since the character flaw is seen as somehow contagious or repulsive, you want to minimize physical or social contact with the bad person. And this signals a desire for maximum social distance.
Which makes sense online.
It's why disgust-based outrage is so perfectly suited for the digital realm, where exclusion is just a click away and actual confrontation is abstract, often text-based.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. The concept of change and permanence. If anger is about the act, the mistake, it seems reparable, right? If I can apologize and fix the damage, the anger should ideally subside. But if disgust is about stable character, is that why online moral condemnation feels so permanent and frankly unforgiving? It feels like once that character judgment is issued, the case is just closed forever. There's no coming back.
You've absolutely hit on the central kind of tragic implication here. Because moral character is perceived as stable and consistent across time and contexts, the condemnation expressed through disgust is presumed to be highly resistant to mitigation or reconciliation.
So apologies don't work.
Well, you can apologize for an action, sure, but it's much harder to convincingly apologize for an inherent stable flaw in who you are.
Meaning that even if the wrongdoer offers a verifiable, heartfelt apology, tries to make amends, which would usually diffuse anger, disgust, lingers.
It lingers, and observers expect it to linger. When a person is judged based on character, the apology itself is often discounted a priori.
How so?
It's often inferred to be just performative or insincere, maybe merely a strategic attempt to save face, rather than genuine repentance that addresses the core supposed flaw.
Wow.
This psychological mechanism basically guarantees that character-based moral outrage has profound longevity and is very, very difficult to reverse. It is designed, you could say, psychologically speaking, for permanent social exclusion.
Okay, so we've established that our ancient, evolved emotional systems are highly specialized. Anger for fixable actions, disgust for permanent character flaws. Now let's look at the infrastructure, the technology, that takes these specialized alarms and transforms them into a constant, global social frenzy. You mentioned the Anthropocene era of morality.
That's a good way to put it. The internet, and social media platforms in particular, act as what psychologists call a supernormal stimulus for moral cognition.
Supernormal stimulus.
Yeah, basically it triggers our evolved instincts way beyond their original design parameters. Our instincts to seek group cohesion, enforce norms, punish perceived cheaters, they evolved for small tribal groups, maybe 50 to 150 people.
Right, Dunbar's number and all that.
Exactly. Now, social media triggers these same instincts, but with orders of magnitude more intensity and frequency. We are constantly exposed to moral violations, real or perceived, on a global scale, 247.
And this content isn't just passive information floating by, it's hyper-moralized and incredibly efficient at inducing outrage.
Precisely. People are encountering supposed immoral acts far more often online than they ever would in their real lives, or even through traditional media like newspapers or TV.
And the online versions hit harder.
They do. Crucially, studies show that immoral acts encountered online evoke significantly more outrage than those encountered offline. The sheer scale and speed of the internet transform normal moral impulses into a state of chronic, amplified, almost ritualized outrage, just like you described with that Merce comment earlier.
This constant amplification leads us directly to the MAD model of moral contagion. You mentioned this earlier. It's the roadmap for how platforms systematically turn these specialized emotional signals into viral phenomena. Let's start with them in Tasarum area. How do platforms exploit our natural group identity tendencies?
Right, the motivation is fundamentally group identity-based. We are social creatures, deeply tribal in many ways. And online, group identity, your in-group versus the out-group, is constantly salient, constantly being reinforced.
And outrage signals belonging.
Expressing moral outrage is one of the most powerful and, importantly, low-cost signals of commitment to your in-group values.
Yeah.
It helps solidify your reputation and position within that social circle. It's a form of high-status signaling, showing you're a loyal member.
But the real virality isn't just about supporting your own group. It seems to be driven by the animosity, the collective antagonism toward the other side.
That is the critical distinction that the algorithms have effectively learned. Bashing the outgroup, expressing animosity towards them, drives significantly more engagement, more likes, shares, comments, clicks, than merely expressing support for your own in-group.
Really, negative drives more than positive.
Much more. These moral-emotional posts expressing hostility enjoy a wider reach precisely because they trigger higher emotional responses in more people. And since algorithms are primarily designed to optimize for engagement,
they are structurally designed to promote the most divisive, antagonistic content possible.
You got it. It's an emergent property of optimizing for clicks and shares.
This inherent drive to maximize the wedge between groups, it's perfectly illustrated by that story of Gunter and Eric, the two lifelong friends you mentioned.
Ah, yes, that anecdote is, well, it's heartbreaking, really, because it shows the algorithm actively manufacturing polarization almost in real time. Gunter, a small business owner, and Eric, a retired teacher, they actually shared similar politics initially.
But the algorithm found the cracks.
It amplified their subtle differences. Gunter started getting fed these highly inflammatory videos about how socialist policies were supposedly personally destroying his industry and his way of life. Very targeted, very emotional stuff.
And Eric?
Eric, meanwhile, was being fed clips focusing on the dangerous rhetoric and perceived moral failings of the conservative government figures Gunter might align with.
So they were often reacting to clips of the same political speeches, maybe, but the curated, divergent content the algorithms chose drove them to drastically different conclusions about the meaning of those speeches.
Exactly. The algorithms optimized for their individual engagement by feeding them content that framed the opposing view not just as incorrect, but as morally repugnant and fundamentally threatening.
Wow.
And this drove Gunter and Eric to see each other not just as people with different perspectives anymore, but as being morally wrong, maybe even dangerous. The algorithm found that existing hairline crack, their slight political difference, and systematically hammered a wedge into their close, decades-long relationship. It eroded nuanced discourse right at the human level.
The algorithm is basically harvesting engagement by maximizing that social friction. Okay, moving on. The A in MAD stands for attention. Why does moral outrage capture our attention so effectively in this attention economy?
Because in this environment, human attention is the single most scarce and valuable resource. That's the commodity being bought and sold. Algorithms are essentially amoral. They don't value truth or kindness or nuance.
They just value eyeballs on the screen.
Precisely. They optimize solely for time spent on the platform, for engagement, and extreme negative evaluations, especially moral outrage, are supremely attention-grabbing because they exploit two fundamental cognitive biases we all possess.
The negativity bias being the first one, I assume.
Yes,
Yeah.
Exactly. Negative news, threats, and especially perceived moral failings, they naturally stand out more vividly to us than positive or neutral information. Evolutionarily speaking, we're programmed to prioritize potential threats.
And the second bias?
The second is our profound, evolved sensitivity towards moral content itself. We are deeply social creatures, programmed to pay keen attention to anything that signals a threat to our social norms or the integrity of our group. Social media just accelerates the speed and scope of this process far beyond its original evolutionary intention.
And the data on this is striking. You mentioned the language itself becomes an engagement metric.
It absolutely does. The metrics demonstrate this optimization perfectly. Research shows that every single moral and emotional word used in a post, words like outrageous, disgusting, shameful, but also positive ones like courage or justice or betrayal, is associated with an average 20% increase in that post diffusion.
20% per word.
An average of 20% increase in shares, retweets, propagation. So the language of moral fury, or just strong moral judgment, is structurally optimized for virality and mass attention capture by the platform's own systems.
Okay, and finally, the D for design. How does the technical design of these platforms actively lower the barrier to expressing outrage, even when these companies sometimes claim they are trying to promote meaningful interactions?
Right. Well, social media is overwhelmingly designed for System 1 thinking.
Fast thinking.
Fast, emotional, intuitive responses. It deliberately removes the friction that's normally required for thoughtful System 2 thinking, the slow, rational, analytical kind.
How does it remove the friction?
Think about it historically. Expressing moral condemnation or engaging in a serious confrontation usually required physical presence, which invokes empathy. You see the other person's reaction, or at least the friction of composing a letter or making a phone call.
Yeah, you naturally moderate your tone when you see the human reaction.
Exactly. But online, we are primarily communicating through asynchronous, often text-based interfaces.
Right, less immediate feedback.
And text-based interaction tends to conceal the more thoughtful mind behind it. It removes the empathetic cues required to moderate antagonism naturally.
Okay.
So when the barrier to expressing outrage is reduced to the single click of an anger react button, we're far more likely to rely on those quick emotional moral judgments because the friction, the cost of expressing it's basically gone.
Precisely. And this is where that infamous algorithmic failure revealed in the Facebook files becomes critically important.
The 2018 shift to boost meaningful social interactions, or MSI. What exactly did that design change do, and how did it backfire so badly? Well, the stated intention of the MSI shift was allegedly to foster better engagement between friends and family, prioritize personal connections over publisher content. Sounds good, right?
Sounds reasonable, though. Yeah.
However, the technical implementation was flawed and ultimately devastating for public discourse. The system internally weighted different kinds of interactions, giving them scores. And it gave an outsized score, 5 points apparently, to emotional reactions like the anger react button, and also to long engaged comment threads.
Which, as we know from experience, are often just flame wars, heated arguments.
They very often are. So by rewarding those sensational, highly emotional, and often polarizing interactions with the highest meaningful score, the algorithm essentially incentivized conflict and amplified political polarization.
That's incredible.
It treated a lengthy, furious debate between two strangers arguing in the comments section as significantly more meaningful interaction than, say, a simple positive like or love reaction on a family photo.
So the technical design, in its quest to maximize measurable engagement, actively rewarded and amplified outrage and antagonism. It proved that the platform's architecture itself dictates the moral climate.
Absolutely. The road to hell is paved with engagement metrics, you might say.
So if the architecture of the internet structurally rewards moral outrage, we start seeing this psychological shift where the expression of condemnation becomes the goal itself, entirely disconnected from achieving actual justice or solving whatever the initial problem was.
Precisely. The act of expressing condemnation transforms into what Germans call an Ersatzhandlung, a substitute action.
A substitute action.
Yeah. When people feel passive, maybe powerless or overwhelmed by complex global issues or rapid technological change, posting an angry screed online simulates activity. It gives the person the immediate, satisfying feeling of doing something, of taking a stand, even if they are not tangibly engaging with the underlying issue at all. It's kind of self-soothing through performance.
And this simulation of effort is deeply linked to what you called moral narcissism.
Yes. Moral narcissism is essentially the tendency towards self-affirmation through public moral indignation. Expressing this outrage online is incredibly low cost, requires almost no real sacrifice, yet it's highly socially rewarding within your chosen group.
You get likes, shares, supportive comments.
Exactly. It provides validation and belongingness to the in-group. You get that brief, euphoric, short push of moral energy, as one researcher called it, that leaves you feeling good, righteous, and affirmed as a morally superior person without having to risk anything substantial like actual community organizing or direct confrontation or deep policy study or financial contribution.
The anecdote about Jonas you shared perfectly captures this low-cost, high-reward cycle, doesn't it?
It really does. Jonas was described as a young man who felt entirely invisible in his very anonymous Berlin office job. He felt he lacked social status and professional validation, just felt like a cog in the machine. Then, when a minor local politician made some clumsy, ambiguous remark about local housing policy, Jonas posted this furious multi-part thread condemning the remark as clear evidence of structural moral failure, deep-seated prejudice, the works.
And the reaction.
Explosive within his online circle. He was immediately flooded with affirmation. Comments like, "You're so right, finally someone said it. Thank you for your moral clarity."
So in that singular moment, he gains the status he craved.
Instantaneously. He transforms from this invisible low-status employee into a self-affirmed moral leader for his online community, simply by expressing outrage effectively. That feeling of being right, of being validated by his in-group, and of gaining status becomes a powerful, immediate psychological reward loop. It's self-affirmation cleverly disguised as social activism.
Wow. The consequence of this engineered, reward-driven architecture is, as you said, profound for language itself. It stops being a tool for negotiation or understanding and becomes this volatile trigger zone.
Absolutely. We see a fundamental shift in how public discourse operates. People stop listening for the sense, the content, or the intended meaning of a statement.
Instead,
They scrutinize it almost exclusively for its potential symbolic explosive force. The speaker themselves, their perceived identity and group affiliation, is weighed far more heavily than what they actually say.
which is the ultimate weaponized manifestation of that attribution bias we discussed earlier.
Exactly. A phrase is no longer a collection of words conveying meaning. It becomes an instant declaration of a permanent moral disposition. Every utterance is a potential purity test.
And this breakdown can halt any constructive discussion entirely. We see it even in the most mundane local settings, like that town hall meeting a journalist described covering.
Oh, that case is such a clear demonstration of how impossible it becomes to solve complex, difficult problems when every single word is treated as a potential weapon.
What happened there?
A local community leader was trying to address a necessary but very difficult topic: a severe budget deficit related to funding local social services. She needed to explain the financial strain, honestly.
Okay, a common problem.
Right. And she used the word burden in a strictly financial context, referring specifically to the numerical cost imposed on the town's budget by these services.
And what was the immediate reaction?
The entire debate ceased instantly, just stopped dead. She was shouted down, accused of using dehumanizing rhetoric.
Just for the word burden.
Just for that word. The accusation immediately shifted to her moral character, that using the word burden was irrefutable evidence that she fundamentally viewed the recipients of social services as inferior, as, well, burdens themselves.
So the rest of the meeting?
The rest of the meeting, the actual critical discussion about the very real budget deficit that necessitated difficult choices, it just stopped entirely. Vanished.
The conversation shifted from discussing, say, a $2 million budget hole to debating a single 6-letter word choice.
It became an existential moral test of the speaker, not a discussion of the problem. And the ability to have the constructive, difficult conversations needed to solve complex shared problems, like how to sustainably finance essential social services, it just evaporates completely.
Yeah.
When every word is treated as a potential trigger, communication is no longer a bridge built for dialogue. It becomes a minefield designed for moral reckoning.
And this creates a society that over-evaluates every utterance for symbolic risk.
Which leads people to either speak incredibly vaguely and defensively, making them even more susceptible to misinterpretation, paradoxically, or to just retreat from public life entirely, fearing the inevitable misstep.
This environment obviously fuels the mechanics of digital retribution, what's often referred to as cancel culture. Online users, sometimes acting as anonymous keyboard warriors, leverage this exact mechanism to enforce accountability and exclusion, primarily through the hyper-analysis of language.
And this mechanism is entirely dependent on the speed and mobilization capabilities provided by the digital architecture we've been discussing. Hashtags, symbolic gestures, screenshots taken out of context, they're used to quickly mobilize collective outrage.
Turning individual condemnation into a mass phenomenon almost instantly.
Right. And when thousands of people petition concurrently online, it creates this chain reaction of digital retribution, exerting immense pressure on platforms, employers, sponsors, universities, you name it, to sever ties with the targeted individual or brand. Reputational harm in this hyper-vigilant trigger zone is often instantaneous and, due to the character judgment involved, frequently irreversible.
But the outcome of this digital retribution seems to hinge completely on how the condemned individual responds, specifically the linguistic choices they make in their apology or defense. The contrast between those two content creators in Bangladesh, Tasrif Khan and Tawhid Afridi, following a major political upheaval, that offers a really clinical case study in this whole sociolinguistic dimension.
Yes, they offer a remarkably clear lesson on the sociolinguistics of apology, specifically in a context where public discourse has been violently moralized by real-world events. Tazarp Khan initially faced intense scrutiny following the student-led revolt against the autocratic government. His past loyalties were questioned.
Okay.
But as the political landscape definitively shifted, and this was a real revolution, the students ultimately overthrew the regime. He demonstrated incredible adaptive ability linguistically.
He adapted his tone and his words to align with the new power structure, the new prevailing morality.
Exactly. He fundamentally altered his language, his tone, his delivery in his public communications. He explicitly confirmed past allegations he had made against others under the old regime, framing it as speaking truth to power now. He started using emotionally charged words that fit the new cultural standard, demanding justice, reform, and celebrating the revolution.
And it worked.
By demonstrating this linguistic flexibility and performing sincerity within this new framework, he earned public forgiveness. He was able to recover his career and his credibility remarkably quickly.
Wow. Conversely, Tawhid Afridi, who had actively supported the deposed autocracy, refused or was unable to make that linguistic change.
That's right. Tawhid Afridi issued an apology video after the revolution succeeded, but it was immediately and widely deemed tone-deaf, false, and unauthentic by the public online.
Why? What was wrong with it?
His words, his phrasing, his tone, they directly contradicted his well-known past actions and loyalties to the previous regime. He failed entirely to modify his discourse to fit the new political and cultural context that now valued words like justice, freedom, and condemned betrayal as the defining moral themes.
So because he refused, or maybe just wasn't able to modify his language in a way the public could believe within that new moral reality, he lost all credibility and suffered permanent exclusion.
His words were weighed, certainly, but they were found wanting because they utterly failed the test of sincerity dictated by the new moral framework. Tawhid's downfall was effectively sealed by his linguistic rigidity, his inability to perform the required contrition convincingly.
In that moment, the consistency of his perceived moral character, as judged by the public based on his past actions, was prioritized entirely over his attempt at damage control via apology.
Apology couldn't overcome the character judgment.
This loop brings us right back to the beginning, doesn't it? We started with Mirza's single ambiguous comment that triggered this ritualized massive outrage. We found that outrage is specialized disgust targeting character, anger targeting actions, and it's systematically amplified by the MAD model inherent in social media architecture. And the result is that language itself has become this treacherous minefield where genuine dialogue is often replaced by loyalty signaling and moral performance.
And that key psychological finding remains absolutely central. When an ambiguous statement is attributed to a stable, bad moral character, often via that signal of disgust, the condemnation becomes dispositional. It becomes about who the person is, fundamentally.
Which means it's incredibly difficult, perhaps even impossible, to reverse. The Mertz comment wasn't debated on its merits. It was immediately taken as evidence of who he is, not just what he happened to say in that moment.
Precisely. The attribution was immediate and character-based.
So, okay. What does this all mean for us, for you listening? As participants, willing or unwilling, in this complex, hyper-moralized communication environment?
Well, I think we first have to recognize the underlying driver, the paradox here.
Yeah.
Building on that idea of the trigger zone, the more sensitively and cautiously language is treated in public discourse, the more hyper-aware everyone becomes of words, the more vulnerable that language actually becomes to misinterpretation and deliberate attack. It's a strange feedback loop.
So trying to be more careful makes things riskier.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
A society that over-evaluates every single word for its potential symbolic risk eventually begins to misunderstand itself, because it loses the capacity or the willingness to listen for the actual sense behind the phrase, for the intended meaning, however imperfectly expressed.
And the person expressing the outrage.
Often, perhaps not always, but often, the person expressing intense moral certainty in this kind of environment is fighting not primarily against an external injustice out there in the world, but perhaps more against their own internal discomfort, their unbehagen, that feeling of unease or insecurity in a complex and changing world. And they use moral condemnation, moral certainty, as an emotionally rewarding, high-status shield against that discomfort.